All right. Can you please introduce yourself, Polly?
Hi, Tasha. I'm Polly Ely. I'm a marriage and family therapist and founder of a method that I call the lab method, which has over time evolved into something called parent school.
Oh, I like Parrot School.
Yeah, so parent school is essentially like a modern, fun, relaxed place where you can come and get some really immediate, tactical, practical help with parenting, very specific stuff that we all kind of collectively struggle with, sort of the same things, but you can come and get that live, that kind of help that is more immediately helpful. Um, and I offer those locally and teach in local organizations and schools all around the Bay Area. And now I'm starting a podcast
Oh,
teaching
that's
people.
exciting, exciting.
Yeah.
So I wanted to pick your brain today about specifically, because there's so much to do with parenting, but specifically siblings and how to get them to get along better. So if I have questions to nitpick, but the biggest one, and I know it's a huge topic, but how do you get siblings to get along?
How do I get siblings to get along? Well, gosh, that's such a big question. And I know we'll just kind of wormhole our way into it. But one of the first things that kind of came up for me as I was doing this live exploration of how do I get my two kids to get along was that I actually had to really focus on the 1 in 10 moments that they actually were getting along. That my focus, just from a behavioral standpoint, was really strongly focused on the times when they were not getting along. And because I was more focused on those moments, more tense, and they got more of my energy when they were not getting along, I inadvertently fueled the not getting along cycle.
Huh, interesting. So you're highlighting to going to the positive.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for me, all of the lab method asks us to get more conscious with what we're doing, how we're inadvertently fueling negative cycles and patterns of interaction in the home.
Mhm.
And that was my big starting point, was thinking, oh, if I've got my lens on for what's wrong, I'm catching it, and my kids are picking up on that. That's what I'm looking for, and they'll get in the spotlight however,
Yeah.
however they can. And the spotlight for me was what's not working and who's screwing around.
Okay, so now you've got like this one in 10. I'll just use your example of 1 in 10 positive. You see it, you're like, oh, you're blowing it up, going, oh my gosh, this is so great. You guys are so kind to each other. I can just see myself doing this with my own children. So what would be, I'm going to use the typical phrase, a life hack to next steps, tools to get them to the next step of having less friction in the house?
Well, one thing I would just kind of nuance about when I do notice them getting along, if I get too jacked up and too like evaluative about them, they'll also sense that I'm overly invested in their relationship. And
Mhm.
one of the things that I realized I needed to do was back up and trust that, if these two were going to fall in love with each other, they're going to fall in love with each other or they're not. There's a chemistry element to this that with all of my fantasies and all of my wishes, I cannot puppet them into a close relationship. It's really going to ultimately be for them to decide. However, when I am noticing them being kind with each other, I'm going to really work on using I statements instead of you. And this is really important. If I get very invested in them and their behavior, I can also kind of create a competition between them, of who's mom noticing the most. I mean, there's so many cycles and things, that patterns of interaction that occur. So keeping the comments to an I statement, which is, I feel really proud of how you are being with each other right now. And it's a
Mm.
soft one. It doesn't have it's not a big show, but it's just, I really am loving the way you're sharing with each other right now. And that might be a time when I slow my voice down, connect with my heart, and let them know that it's really touching to see them be so sweet with each other, for me.
Yeah.
And that just changes the dynamic a little bit from mom noticed me, no, she didn't, no, she noticed me, to mom's just noticing how she feels being in the room with us when we're getting along.
Yeah, because there's
That makes
research.
sense.
Yeah, it does. And the research I've read is that children actually fight more in the presence of the parent. What do you think that's about? Is it about the attention?
I think it's about sort of what I would call dueling deprivation. When they're deprived of a certain, or not even deprived, but they sense or interpret that there's a finite amount of attention to go around. And if only one of us can get it, there's something to fight for. It kind of fuels what is that? A duel in a way for the attention. So we can fuel that inadvertently with you statements. You're so good at this. You're really smart. You shared. Yay, you. Like you causes a lot of, I don't even know if I'm talking right to what you asked, but
Yeah.
it creates a sense of a competition between them. Oh, you got noticed. No, now I want to be noticed.
Yeah.
And we can diffuse that and sort of take the energy out of it by bringing it back to how I feel being next to you
Mm.
as a parent.
Mm-hmm.
And it also gets me out of a constant role of evaluating people around me, which for me actually doesn't feel great. Whether I'm evaluating them positively or negatively, I become this arbiter of who's good and who's bad. And every time I enter the room, my kids are like, oh, here's the evaluation gal. Who's going to get the approval and who's not? And
Yeah.
let's start the second she walks in the room. Let's start silently dueling for that approval.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So what happens what are your thoughts on, traditionally there've been, okay, so let's say they're actually dueling and fighting, and traditionally we've had, parents stay out of it. That's what, our generations before you and me, that's what the idea was. And now, it's more getting involved. What are your stance of how to get involved when the siblings are fighting? Where do you land?
Yeah. Well, I believe that social justice is learned in the home, and it starts in the home. And the way that I work to protect the emotional and physical safety of each person in our home so that everyone gets to stay safe, that builds like a long-lasting template or blueprint inside of a kid that says, I'm important, I matter, and I don't ever need to be in a situation where I'm being either abused or harassed or diminished or devalued. And for me, it was my own value and hope, coming from where I came from, that everyone in our home would get to stay safe. And that, as part of the lab method, one of the things that really helped me ground in my parenting was language. Certain little phrases that I could use during tense moments that would allow me to just grab onto a sentence and hold on tight to it when I didn't know what else to do. And one of the sentences that I grabbed onto and held on tight to was, everyone gets to stay safe in our home. When people feel that they will be protected on an emotional and physical level, they relax.
Yes.
And they don't fight as much. But when we worry that no one's going to stand in for us and we are on our own, I think one of the mistakes that maybe I was making and a lot of people make is that we would talk at them when they were being emotionally or physically unsafe with each other by saying kind of catchphrases that are what I call throwaways. In a way, we all use them. That's not okay. We don't do that in this house. Is sort of like making noise and squawking at them, when instead, in a moment where somebody is being either emotionally, physically abusive with someone else, we get up and physically use our body to stand between them, to block not just the energy, but the words and the physicality. So I will actually use my strength and my leadership, not to come at anyone or intimidate them, but literally to stop the transmission of negative energy. And so that's number one. Number two is I would use the phrase, you'll have to find another way to be with your sibling right now. If you can't, I'll help you leave the room. And those words are just, I want to give you an opportunity. If you can find another way, great. Do you need help? I'd be happy to whisper another possibility in your ear. But if you want to just degrade your sibling or make them feel bad, and I will use words just like that, degrade, that's not an option. And that's where I get into my business voice. My voice gets clipped, low and slow. and I'm going to help you out of here if this is going to continue.
Okay.
So for me, that just really helped me kind of take the reins in a moment where an unsafe situation was starting to develop, and fighting is not always unsafe. Sometimes people are just mad and it's actually okay.
Yeah. How do you, sorry to interrupt you, how do you know when to let them fight and how do you know when to intervene? What's that line?
Well, for me, the line is when it's getting personal, when somebody is starting to call names, or throw punches or try to do emotional or physical damage to the other person. Now, this is interesting because some kids can do it very subtly.
Yes.
Now, I had when I was at my height with my two kids of this situation, I had one that could diminish and degrade the other one in very subtle ways. But I was picking up on it and letting it go for a while because I couldn't quite identify it. It wasn't like throwing a punch, but it was an emotional punch. And I pulled her aside and said, "Do you know that when you make fun of your brother for how he learns, that's like throwing an emotional punch. And I'm not going to let you throw punches at him anymore. And if he ever threw a physical punch at you or an emotional punch, I would stand in for you too."
Mm.
So she got the message that mom isn't she's not allowing this to happen, and that emotional violence is as damaging sometimes as physical violence is, and kids just need that to be explained to them.
Yeah. Huh.
I think, not to overtalk here, Tasha, but there's one element too that really got me when I was in school for becoming a family therapist. And I was doing my thousands of hours of internship and meeting with so many people who actually were more injured, not by the fact that their sibling had come after them, but that nobody stood in for them or stood up.
Yes.
That there was more emotional pain that lasted a lifetime and heartbreak. That why didn't somebody stop this from happening?
Yeah.
And that just gives me chills. I feel like that's the social justice piece that we're all learning, is when you see something going on, you stop it. You stop it in any way that you can, out of love for these people, because we don't really want them to practice doing this kind of thing to their sibling, because their sibling is essentially their next, their roommate,
Yes.
their practice partner for life.
Yes.
Their future partner. The sibling is a stand-in for all these people that they're going to be with in their life, that they're going to have to work stuff out with. And if they lay down a bunch of tracks diminishing that person, do you know what I mean? Their brain goes, "Oh, I know how to do this. I'm good at abusing people when I get pissed."
What do you feel about people saying that it's their way of learning conflict and tolerating it? And what do you say to that?
Well, I think, if you're growing up in a family and there's any kind of fighting that goes on, you're learning how to tolerate conflict. I mean, unless you've got a family who's denying everything that is difficult, which is also its own kind of problem. Learning how to tolerate conflict is just part of the game of being a person in a family. Yeah. Learning how to resolve conflict is another thing. And in the world that I teach and lived in, we did, a couple of things. We knew that when at least we were raging or really, really angry, it really wasn't appropriate for us to be around each other. And as a family, we made not just that pact, but that was based on the research, which is when we go into kind of a rage mode or really angry space, we're not supposed to be working anything out with anyone. We actually need to go get some space, take some breaths, and let it kind of burn off a little bit before we do come back and do a do-over, redo the moment, and try to do it in a way that we can feel proud of. This is where, Tasha, I would really hold my ground, which is, we have to redo this moment right now, but we do have to redo this moment.
Oh, I like that. So what do you mean by do-over? Can you explain that?
Yeah. So a lot of the time, I would separate my kids and they would actually take some time to calm down. And often out of that, there would be some natural sense of wanting to set things right right that were made wrong, that
Mm.
it feels good really for everyone to get things back on track.
Mhm.
And I didn't know quite how to do that until I did about 1,000 experiments and found out that fine, if we're going to take a time out or we're going to, take space, that's fine. When both parties are ready, and this is an important part, when both parties feel ready, we come back and either do a repair where each person owns a piece of the mess, a bit of the mess, not the whole one, because that's too much for anybody to hold. But I ask each one, is there one thing that you did that made it harder, do you think?
Yeah.
And this is an accountability practice piece where we're both just owning that we both did a little something. And I will put myself in there too, because I almost always do something too that makes it just a little bit harder
Yeah.
on someone. I
Yeah.
raised my voice, and that actually added stress to the situation. And I'm at that moment, I'm modeling that whenever we're in the room together, we're all, we're all playing a little bit of a card. And often that card that we're playing is instigating or creating a more tense situation. So that's number one, we could do a repair. But often the repair doesn't feel totally genuine. And I would notice sometimes my daughter would snicker through a repair and it didn't feel very authentic to me. And I didn't want to be that old school gal, dragging a kid by their ear and saying, say you're sorry, because that felt futile. And like, then they would just learn how to go through the motions of saying I'm sorry when they didn't mean it. So if a genuine repair didn't feel like it could be had, then I would say, well, how about we just do that whole scene over?
Mhm.
Like, and just see if we can do it in a way that feels good to each of us, So it's like if we were having that same situation play out, but this time we felt really proud of how we got through it, let's just do that. Now, we would do it live like a play, and we would stay with it until it did feel good. And herein lies the moment in which learning becomes kind of crystallized, is when we end on a good note, when we feel heard, seen, and actually like we brought our best self forward. And then my attachment figure, who's my mom, looks at me with her eyes and says, I am so proud of you. And the way you just did that over again today makes me know that like you're exactly the right kid I was supposed to get. I feel so proud. Just so that moment of me slowing down, connecting with them and letting them know it's not the conflict that makes, or the peace that makes this great. It's how we move through it. And the fact that you're willing to slow down and try this again makes you a really, really special person in my eyes.
Yeah, because I can imagine fast forwarding to them being in a relationship, a marriage 20 years later and going, okay, here's a conflict. And then if they're never learning that healing, that skill to heal,
Yeah.
how do we go from this rupture to repair? Then, what is it? It's just, a matter of time if there's never those repairs. So if you're teaching such a life skill through a sibling, or just in a family, I mean, what a gift.
Totally. I think you're right on the money. I mean, you could not cue it up better, but you do have to really prioritize that circling back and setting things right that were made wrong, so that once that's over, we can all move on. Kids shed those layers really easily, and we're not slowly over time accumulating rupture after rupture after rupture without any healing, like you said. Which, by the way, by the time you've had about 11 years of rupture without any healing and you're going into your adolescence, that creates a big pile of like what I call like just emotional gunk that gets stuck inside our emotional pipes that starts to begin the process of feeling both anxious and depressed. When I've got that much conflict baked in over time and no healing and no resolution, I end up starting to feel down and low energy.
Yeah.
Which is
So,
fascinating to me.
yeah, it is. So if I could like switch a little gears, because you brought up adolescence, and I also feel like there's such expectations with siblings. Like we expect that we're going to be, this loving relationship, and it's going to be, you know, they're holding hands. And I see parents even like, well, I want them to share a bedroom because I want this to happen. And, you know, I could go on a tangent here, but what are the real expectations for siblings as they go through a next developmental phase? Because it seems like from an offset that they could switch into a more harmonious place like middle school, high school. Do you see that happening, or does the pattern just sort of stay the same as whatever groundwork was set in the earlier years?
I think it can turn. And again, it's helpful to go back and, you know, take yourself out of the equation. What happens between them ultimately is really a lot about chemistry. It doesn't have a whole lot to do with my fantasy for them. I can do some things to help them conjure a relationship that makes that they want. And, you know, one of the things that I have for free on my website is the sibling manifesto. And the sibling manifesto is like 3 or 4 pages of questions about, and it's multiple choice, so nobody has to think too hard. What kind of relationship do you want?
Yeah.
And when you get into tense moments, how do you want to handle it? And literally having them in a room together to think through all the little pinch points of their relationship. How do they want to grow this? Because ultimately what I said to my kids was, this is up to you. I mean, you don't have to be friends, and you can just go, you know, side by side through your life and then diverge, and we'll see each other on holidays, or you can build a friendship. But I guess it starts with you defining what kind of relationship you want. And this really actually was kind of a light bulb moment for our whole family, especially when they found out they had authorship. It wasn't just me and my fantasy and my agenda for them, because they weren't on board for that. They didn't co-author that.
Yeah.
But once we started to slow down and ask them, what kind of relationship do you want? I couldn't believe the quality and depth of what they said to, you know, in a family meeting.
Yeah, that's
What they
really, I
actually
love
wanted.
that idea of giving them agency for it. I also, it kind of brings to mind of this little bit of a pet peeve I have with media not portraying siblings getting along enough to plant that seed of what can happen.
Hmm.
There's certain shows that when my kids were younger, I'm like, you're not watching that, because every single episode was the siblings fighting.
Interesting.
And yeah, and there's a lot of books that it's sibling fighting, and I'm like, okay, you know, I want a role model that you guys can get along, not to say it's going to happen, but to implement that idea that is not
Yeah.
this set script, and it can be this harmonious script. And I read some research what prompted me of like, the more that they see the aggravation between siblings, the more they will, you know, it's a setting of the expectations.
Wow, that's really powerful. And, you know, what goes hand in glove with that is the more they, you know, they're watching their parents do things, and that off gassing that comes from their parents' tension will also spill out to how they deal with each other.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
It all,
Yeah. So,
it's all one system, right? System
yeah.
theory. It's like, where is it all coming, and what comes in too from these other places.
Yeah.
Um,
Really
um,
fascinating. I love that. I really love your perspective, Tasha, of saying it's really possible, and you can have any relationship you want, and that you were a stand for your kids to have a positive relationship with each other.
yeah,
I think the thing is, I think so many parents forget that if you get some of them, you get them to invest in that a little bit with what they actually do want, and get really specific, like, how do you want to do sharing of your stuff or not sharing? What things are off limits to each other? What things are like, yeah, you can use it, but you need to ask me first? And what things are like, have at it, I don't care?
yeah,
Those are like lovely ways to set up terms and boundaries, which are a huge part of the lab method, which is setting up some boundaries, because this isn't a free for all. They don't want to share every single part of their life with each other.
yeah,
And once you give them permission to say, let's say on the young end, my tricycle's off limits. I don't want anyone else using that. And on the older end, you know, the things that are in this part of my closet, not for borrowing.
yeah.
No. And
That's
that they actually
flexible.
like learn, they can mark those things to indicate that's not for you.
Yeah. It's like, again, comes back to that agency.
I mean, this is such a great way for her to practice, or anyone to practice boundaries.
Yeah.
That sibling is somebody you can practice, what are our rules about going into each other's rooms? Do we knock and wait, or do we knock and enter, or do we just not knock? How do you guys want it? And ultimately, they have these incredible skills, collaboration skills, where they do actually often find agreement. After this hour, I don't want you to come in. Or, I mean, they come up with their own terms, and it's like beautiful. My husband and I were their secretary, and we literally wrote out the relationship they wanted. Mm-hmm. And it played out really beautifully. They were so much more harmonious when they set up the boundaries that they wanted with each other. It was kind of cool to me.
That is fantastic. All right. So before we wrap up, I have another question for you, and I hate to have it as a negative start, but what is one of the biggest mistakes that you see parents making? Or I can rephrase this as, what would you say would be make the biggest bang for their buck if they were going to change something? Like,
I would say to really, for me, I can only say for me, and I do, obviously work with a lot of families, but preserving your children in front of each other is a really important, and to me, changes the environment and the air in the home. And what I mean by that is, when one child got in trouble, if I was sort of having my more unconscious moment, I would speak a little bit derogatorily about the child who got in trouble. I would say, I would actually play them a little bit against each other. I would obviously we all know the cycle of one kid starts acting like a turkey, the other one pops right into angel child mode, right? It's like whack-a-mole. And that
never happened to me in my household.
Right.
Never.
So in that moment, I would often be like, yeah, you're really in line. And I would actually fuel a sort of good kid, bad kid vibe in the house. And there was lots of ways that I realized I was fueling a competitive environment. And when I did a couple things. One, when somebody needed to be corrected or criticized, if you will, I learned to do it in their ear or step aside with them rather than do it in front of their sibling, because it was really a lot for them to take the criticism in the first place, but to do it in front of a sibling who'd be like, yeah, that was too much. It created too much tension. Mm-hmm. So I just saw tension levels really drop down when I started to preserve their not integrity, their what is the word? Their identity, their positive self-image in front of their sibling. The other thing is that when one of them would kind of go off course or was not in the flow, I would also use words like, I think your sibling forgot, what's supposed to happen here, or how to get their homework done without throwing pencils across the room. And I'm pretty certain that he or she will remember soon. I'm rooting for him. Yeah. And what was happening, the subtext of that, when I'm rooting for your sibling, even when they're not in the room, you are feeling safer with me too. Because you know that the next time you're not in the room and you're the one who's screwing up, I'm talking to your sibling about how I have total confidence in you, that you're going to pull this together. You're going to remember what you're supposed to do. And I'm rooting for you rather than.
Yeah, there's no judgment. There's a lack of judgment in there.
There's no judgment. And there's a feeling of, I am an ally. I'm not triangulating. I'm not going with that one kid who's doing well and saying, yeah, you're really rocking. Your siblings are really, really screwing up right now, which I gotta say, it was my first move. It was what I knew to do, but it ended up fueling a really competitive, sort of deprived environment in terms of attention. And just that word, forgetting and remembering, kind of helped everyone feel compassionate toward themselves and towards each other when somebody was off track. And they knew my judgment wasn't, like you said, it wasn't harsh judgment. It was just like, yeah, we all fall off track and then we get on track and then we fall off track and we get on track. And hopefully the people who love you are rooting for you.
Oh,
And that,
it's just a nice spirit to have too, you know.
yeah,
Even
yeah, it felt good to me. It feels good to me.
yeah, and we're gonna screw up parenting here and there, but I always fall back on you don't have to, a good enough parent. And it's because we're just so tough on ourselves, and we're, it's just like, okay, we're enough. It's okay.
100%.
Yeah. I have so enjoyed talking to you, and I could talk to you for a long, long time. But it will so before we go, where can people find you?
Okay. So you can find me at my website. It's called The Lab Method, LAB, which stands for Language, Attachment, and Boundaries.
Okay.
The Lab Method.com is where you can kind of find out about our local labs that are going on for Parent School. And we've got some just produced podcasts that are really fun to listen to, and they'll be continuing. And we've got an app coming up that will allow people to not just find out what to do and what to say in those pinch point moments, but you'll even be able to press the button in the app to hear my voice deliver those words, so that if you're somebody who's working with tone or struggling with how to deliver messages so that it says, it gets you where you want to go and gets people to want to follow you, you can hear that. And that was something that I really worked on a lot as a parent, was just how to deliver my messages without judgment and without an edge. So
yeah, there's so much said between the words, right? We can have the perfect words, but there's the body language and the tone. And
yeah, that's right.
app work so you can appear in my house. That'd be so great.
I
Right?
would like to be in your pocket. Yeah.
I always think having like a couple moms in the house would be great too, getting them out to school. If I could just multiply the moms.
Yeah. And, just on the heels of what you had just asked, which is, what else can they find? Where can they find you?
Yeah.
On my website, there's also videos of labs that I've given in the past. And there's one called the Sibling Lab. Mm-hmm. And there is just probably 100 wonderful little hacks, if you will, or practical fixes to difficult situations that show up in the house all day long, from dinner to morning to, all the way through, that I'd love to share with people. It's not super professionally done, but it's super helpful to people.
It's fantastic. That's great. Yeah. And I love that how social media now, it's very raw and it's relatable. So whatever it is, I'm sure it's great. Your content's fabulous.
Thank you, Tasha.
So it's such a pleasure. Yeah, thank you for your time, your insight, your knowledge, your everything. And I hope people come and check out your stuff.
Thank you so much.